Hi, my name's Phoebe. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to the first episode of A History of English Theatre. Um, and actually, I think I've got you all here under false pretenses because it's not actually English theatre where we're starting. We're starting in ancient Greece. And I'm just going to dive right in and just like snap through it. But if you have any questions or anything, leave a comment below. If you've got any comments, if you've got like a favourite Greek tragedy, leave a comment. Also, give us a like, give us a subscribe, because I'm going to be doing a few of these. So if you want to like see the rest of it, do that and then you'll get notifications. So anyway, where do we begin? So let's set the scene. 700 BC. um, what was it like for a Greek audience coming to the theatre? So in Greece, theatre was often entertainment as part of a bigger festival. So think about it more like Glastonbury than any, like that's the best modern comparison is like a big music festival like Glastonbury or Latitude, or somewhere that where there's poetry, there's like people doing circus acts, there's people fighting after a few too many drinks. That's what we're talking about. And I think the most famous of these was probably the Festival of Dionysus. So everyone remembers Dionysus because he's the fun party god. He's the god of wine, fertility, and ecstasy. Who wouldn't want him at a party, right? And therefore, sometimes people think of Greek theatre as being Dionysian theatre because a lot of the theatre that survives to this day was originally submitted as like an offering to the gods in the Dionysian festival. Um, and they would have included things like dancing on stage. People would have been singing. There would have been musicians, and there would have even been games and things surrounding the plays. Playwrights who wanted to put on a production in the festival would submit their work as part of a competition, and typically in the Dionysian festival you had three playwrights who would compete with each other, and as in order to kind of like submit your work, you had to, and be part of the competition, you had to give three tragedies. So we often see Greek tragedies in like groups of three in a triad, and that's because that's how they were submitted to this festival. And you have like stories like Antigone, which is part of the bigger legend that would have been submitted. And then you also have like shorter burlesque style comedies known as satyr plays. Now, not many of these survive, but what we do see later on, and we'll talk about in the next episode, is how the Romans kind of were inspired by the old comedies of the Greek, which are now like the super old comedies of the Greeks, and kind of refreshed these as the Roman comedies, which we do have some of those that have survived, and became a bit more popular. So yeah, so we're starting off at, instead of it being in like a stuffy old theatre, we're starting off outdoors in an amphitheatre. Um, so like the most famous amphitheatre that you will probably know about is the Acropolis. And some of these theatres were huge because they're part of these like big religious festivals. So they would have accommodated like 14,000 people at a time. The other important thing is that the way these are built is to accommodate for, like, there'd be a lot of noise, right, at these festivals. So the acoustics and the way that these theatres are built they're built to channel sound from the stage out into the audience. And if you've ever been to one of these spaces, you'll be able to find always a sweet spot. And these theatres were like the Greeks had a good understanding of how sound and acoustic physics worked. They were built with mathematicians, these amphitheatres, and actually they're very, very successful. Like we still use this type of theatre design even today. So like in my hometown there's a place called the Brighton Open Air Theatre, which is the same amphitheatre style. It's got that staged seating, and you can see here that's like some fella, although there is the sweet spot in the Brighton Open Air Theatre is a little bit further forward. So I've done like a little arrow, you can see there. That's the sweet spot for the Brighton Open Air Theatre. And if you stand in that spot and talk, you can actually hear your voice echo back at you, even with like a full audience there. So it's a way of before we had like microphones, before we had modern technology, before people sat quietly in the theatre and like unwrapped their sweets like it was a crime. Um, amphitheaters were designed to like get your voice out there as an actor. Um, and there also, you'd have in those steps, you'd have carved wooden seating, so it was relatively comfortable. And typically the theatres were carved into the mountains themselves, which kind of, you can imagine what that would be like. You go up to the theatre, up to this offering of the gods. Everything feels kind of a bit extra special. You're outdoors, and also you're in Greece, so beautiful Mediterranean sunshine. Outdoor theatre in the UK, a little bit less predictable. um but also in these theatres you would have had like scenic backdrops, so these were known as the skenes, or the skene, and I don't know how you say it. I've studied it, don't know how to say it. And in front of you, you would also have had an orchestra pit, and that orchestra pit, or the, well, it was called the orchestra, and that was where the chorus and the musicians would dance and perform for the audience. And typically in a theatre troupe, you're looking at the main story, which was often written like poetry, would have been told by 1 to 3 actors, but then you would have had 2 to 12 to 15 actors would have been your chorus. And all of these actors would have worn masks, and the masks that they wore were also helped. Like everything in Greek theatre is designed to get your voice out, because it's the words, it's the poetry that is telling the story. It's very stylized. There's dancing and spectacle, but like the story is carried by this core poetry that these 3 actors are telling. And you can see in the picture here, the masks have that kind of, it's almost like a kind of funnel around their mouths, and that would have helped project their voices as well across the crowd. And those masks became like synonymous with theatre. So you might recognise like the theatre masks that we kind of say that's the symbol for the theatre. The masks are as old as as old as 700 BC at least. So yeah, so we know that the mask played an important part. And because you've only got 3 actors on stage, the masks also helped tell you which character was which, because they will all be played by a man or one of 3 men. So in order to have different characters, they would swap out different masks and do scenes with each other. And so in terms of women on the stage, no women, all men, all men in ancient Greece. But they do have stories about women. So I hate saying his name. It's just going to expose how bad my Greek is. So Phrynichus is a playwright he's the playwright who is thought to first introduce a female character. So up before Phrynichus introduces female characters to theatre, it was all just stories about men, right? So he's also thought to be the first poet to play. The reason I mention him is that he's a really interesting character in terms of Greece, because he has a few firsts. He also is the first person to base a story on actual historic events. So he wrote a play called The Fall of Miletus. And apparently it was so sad and so moving that the crowd like had like this kind of huge cathartic weeping, if you imagine 14,000 people dramatically weeping by the end of the play, and in response to this incredibly moving play about a war, essentially the fall of Miletus, the city actually fined Phrynichus 1,000 drachma for emotional distress. So he's also probably the first playwright to ever have been like censored in a way, because then the city also forbid the play from ever being performed again. But typically plays were written in dedication to the gods, so it wasn't in dedication to the dogs. Who wouldn't want to dedicate a play to a dog? But that's not what I meant to say. So typically the plays are written in dedication to the gods rather than about real events. Some other exceptions that have survived are, if you think about the play Women of Troy, now that's kind of unique because it's mostly about the women themselves who are left at the end of the fall of the city of Troy. And it also is unusual in that places. There's like the way it depicts women is really interesting for you know, for a society where women weren't even allowed to perform on stage. It's an interesting play and I highly recommend it. And it's been reproduced in lots of different versions of it. And it kind of, you see characters like Cassandra, who no one listened to, and you also see what happens to Helen of Troy as well after the city falls and after Paris dies. I think he gets killed or he runs away and goes into exile. Can't remember. Anyway, so yeah, it's specifically we're talking about stories about gods, and even women of Troy to a certain extent. You have the fall of Troy happens because of disrespect to the gods, so it's like a god's punishment. And it's not until later into the Hellenistic area where we start to see that change. So as we're moving out of the kind of Greek the Greek theatre stage towards the end of that, you see more kind of classical archetypes. So think, and again, like Homer's Odyssey or the Iliad, they're all stories about that you might have a human at the center, but it's usually it's a hero. Sometimes it's a demigod. You know, there's mythical beasts. There's challenges that they have to face, that they have to use their wits, and they have to pay homage to the gods at some point as well. So overall, we can imagine like these plays being something that was extremely stylized, extremely there'd be lots of music, very spectacle, with masks, like, and also in an amphitheater, you're really playing, you're playing the story for the back row. You need to make sure everyone can hear you, so you got to make sure, like, the fella in the back row, yeah, of the 14,000 people, the last guy in can still hear you as well as the guy in the front row. And it's all enormous outdoor spaces. So that's kind of Greek theatre in a nutshell. Next time we're going to jump forward 200 years from the end of the kind of Greek theatre period into the theatre of ancient Rome. So stick around, I hope you enjoy, and I'll, yeah, like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you soon. Bye.